Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our RTPI London series of idea exchanges around different aspects affecting planning in London at the current time, particularly given COVID and planning reform and everything that's affecting our industry at the moment. We're really pleased for this session to have teamed up with Fin and Public Practice. We're hoping to get a good kind of dissemination of ideas between what Fin and that organisation's done with what RTPI are doing across London. And we've got a great lineup of panellists as ever, who will be taking forward and providing different perspectives on today's topic, which is skilling up for recovery. So we've got Richard Blyth, who's head of policy and practice at the RTPI. Who worked very hard over the last couple of weeks to get together the Plan the World We Need campaign and research, which underpins RTPI's campaign internationally, but I think really importantly for what's going on in England and the planning reforms going on there. We've got Fin Williams, who's co-founder and CEO of Public Practice, who's going to tell us about some of the research that the Public Practice Associates have done and Fin's been doing in liaison with local authorities across London and the South East. We've got Meeta, Kaur, who is a partner at Town Legal, also a trustee of the RTPI and a non-exec director of Public Practice, so can provide a perspective from both a private and legal profession in terms of the skill requirements in planning in London at the moment, but also obviously the perspective of the two organisations. And then we're joined by Morgan-Raiwe, who is a programme manager at Meridian Water and is responsible for the recruitment into that programme and has been a strong advocate of public practice. So we're going to hear from Yemi's perspective around her issues in finding the right skills for planning regeneration projects at the moment. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Richard, who's going to give us an overview of some of the recent RTPI research. Okay, over to you, Richard.
Just need to get my screen in a position to show the slides. Okay. So on 29th of June, the RTPI published a major report called Plan the World We Need, which is really concerned with where we go forward from here in relation to a world in which the virus has arrived and it has exposed quite a lot of serious issues. To some extent, the virus what it has done is it has confirmed what we already knew about the need for high quality housing for all, about services that you can reach in your neighbourhoods, about access to public open space and private open space, and about the big inequalities that there are around some of these issues. But it has also been a big challenge because it has threatened, if you like, or certainly caused us to worry about things like our reliance on public transport and how that can function, and will that work safely, and how is a planning system that is geared towards maximising the use of public transport, cycling and walking, how is that going to fare in a world where people may be afraid to use it and want to be increasingly in their own vehicles. In our report, we cover a stock take of how the world, and particularly the UK, is in relation to health, economy, jobs, housing. But then towards the end, we look particularly at the kind of things that we need perhaps to be thinking about in relation to the planning system and planners. And this really divides into two sections. The first bit on this slide is really about skills and functions, and that's, I think, related to today's topic. And now I'll briefly cover the second part, which is really about what governments can do to enable planners to give their best. The virus has affected people in many different ways through bereavement, loss of employment, uncertainty about the future, decline in mental and physical health. And coming out of it, genuinely participatory planning can help decision makers to understand the concerns, needs and aspirations of individuals, communities and businesses. There'll need to be a strong focus on social and climate justice, with the needs of vulnerable people and disadvantaged communities at the fore. And so planners are going to need to have even greater listening and engagement skills than they currently do in order to hear how people are feeling as they come out of this. There's also going to be an increased need for place-based vision and leadership, because an effective recovery requires a common purpose among a wide range of stakeholders, coordinating decisions around land use, infrastructure, resources and investments to create places that shape markets, stimulate innovation and encourage behaviour change over the medium and long term. And planners are well placed to coordinate between these stakeholders, but it also requires making sure that the profession has those ringmaster, convening and diplomatic skills so that we can deliver smart zero carbon energy systems, high-speed broadband, sustainable healthy transport, multifunctional green spaces and so on. We also need integrated and strategic planning. Strategic planning skills seem to have fallen somewhat into abeyance, particularly since 2010 in England, and with possibly London being an exception, but certainly looking forward, we're going to need to see plans over wider areas than single local authorities. We need the skills to be able to do that, and perhaps unlike the former regional spatial strategies, those plans need to be plans that coordinate different investment streams, not just to do with granting permissions for housing. And finally, flexibility and adaptability. You know, we've been used to using projections that are based on long-term trends, and the difficulty both economically and demographically with the position we're now in is that it is very difficult to know what the future will look like. And therefore, the skills in relation to planning are ones around being able to cope with a range of scenarios, work out what they are, and then have plans that can accommodate those scenarios. More time and resources to allow for greater flexibility and innovation. For example, by developing guidance for specific areas and supporting developers with detailed design. If I had another 5 minutes, I would go and unpack what our calls on governments are, but I'm sure Tom will begin to start waving his hands around. So I think I will leave that slide sort of in your mind. And if we want to come back to what we think, what the RTPI thinks governments need to do to enable planners to give up their best, there may be time to cover that in questioning. I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I think for sure we will come back to those topics when we get into the Q&A. And for those of you who are watching, please submit questions through the questions function. We'll be getting into Q&A shortly. So I'll come on to Finn now, who's going to tell us a bit more about some of the work that public practice have been doing, some of the research and conversations that have been going on with local authorities in London and the South East.
Great, thanks Tom, thanks Richard. So I couldn't agree more with what Richard set out and what's written in that report, which I think is really excellent. So I'm not going to repeat the findings of that report. It chimes in many ways. That's resilience and renewal, and that was based on conversations with over 20 local authorities across London and the wider South East. I'm going to talk a bit about how we see COVID-19 changing the job description of the public planner and even actually the role of local government in shaping the future of places, communities, economies. And everyone reads what they want to see into the recovery from COVID-19. And I think there's always a risk with these kind of conversations, what implications might the pandemic have of wishful thinking and the idea that the pandemic has somehow reinforced our existing positions. But at the same time, everything, as Richard just said, is up in the air and nothing could be assumed. particularly in relation to the planning system right now. So I think it is actually a really important moment for the planning profession to wish, to think big, and to show how integral it is to the things that matter most to society right now. Of course, COVID-19 is first and foremost a public health crisis, but it's also exposed and exacerbated existing crises, so underlying crises that were already affecting our built environment. Questions around the future of high streets and town centres, the very real and present inequalities we can see in our housing crisis, social inequality, deep-seated in communities and very visible, of course, across London, and we can't ignore the climate emergency, the presence of which is already affecting our built environment. If anything, it's the most critical thing we should be focusing on longer term. So whilst the full impacts of COVID-19 are yet to be fully felt, I'd argue there's a kind of ticking time bomb of social costs that we're going to see hitting over the next year or two. I think it's important that we think about this not so much as only about the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, but actually how planning can help with preparation for the next crisis, because there will be another and there will be more. We look back to the last major financial, or the last major crisis we faced as a country, 2008 financial crisis. That really, I suppose, has defined my professional career. That's pretty much the year I started in local government. And of course, over the last decade, the government's answer was austerity and deregulation. And I suppose we need to ask, did that response make communities and local economies more resilient to the public health crisis? Well, not if you look at the things like the Marmot Review 10 years on. Did it reduce social inequality? Perhaps not so clear up, but if you look at things like child poverty, that's only gone up. Did it tackle a housing crisis? Well, not if you look at housing affordability or homelessness. And did it improve the sustainability of our environment? Well, not quickly enough, especially if you remember that actually all new homes were supposed to be zero carbon by 2016. So the way that government responds and local government responds to this crisis will have really critical long-term effects on all of our response to all of those major drivers. In terms of what that period, just looking back, the impact that period had on capacities and capabilities, well, understandably, it meant that local authorities had to retrench to their statutory duties to what was being measured and counted by government, whether it's development management process or plan making. And the Plan the World We Need report sets this out really well, really narrowed the scope of planning to become more regulative and reactive. And of course, local plans are fundamental tools, but to really deal with those emerging challenges, these kind of wicked problems, we need a broader scope. We need to expand the agency of planning. And that's what public practice tries to do through our placement programme, through the roles that we work with local authorities to create roles that weren't really there before. And our expression of interest process, and we're right in the middle of getting expressions of interest from local authorities, is a really fascinating way of hearing what the emerging priorities of local government are as they set out what kind of roles they'd like to be filled. And I'm just going to talk now about a number of roles that we see emerging in the wake of COVID-19 and what that might say about the way that the job description of the public planner is changing. So there are probably the highest number of roles around new forms of economic development and regeneration. So developing resilient local economies, whether that's through things like community wealth building or focusing on building local green economies, or by really bringing in skills around co-design and participation to work with local businesses and communities to support alternative models of economic development. We're seeing a number of roles coming forward around transforming streets and urban mobility. Richard mentioned the impact on transport, and we've seen already this wave of temporary streetscape projects, particularly around London. The question now is how do those temporary projects transition to potentially becoming permanent, bringing in skills around active travel, mobility as a service, and rethinking the public sector's role in mobility more broadly than just public transport. So perhaps that means shifting, particularly with organisations like TfL, from thinking about the public sector's role being getting people from A to B to actually reducing demand for travel in the first place. And obviously planning has a huge role to play on that front. So there are a number of roles coming forward around supporting the most vulnerable in society. And obviously in the immediate response, we saw that at community level through mutual aid groups and really brilliant collaboration between local authorities and civic organisations on that front. Now, the question is how local authorities can really build on that process by working across sectors, across agencies, and that demands kind of systems thinking, place-based coordination, and kind of beyond user-centered to society-centered design, I think people call it, sort of service design skills. A number of roles around rethinking public sector land and assets, and in the short response, that really obviously focused on things like emergency response hubs, meanwhile uses to public buildings, but over the medium to longer term, you know, that could shift towards local authorities being really more creative and sort of propositional and bold about how they use their assets, keeping hold of it, and in fact building where the private sector fears to tread, and that obviously is going to involve a lot of skills around property and viability and delivery. Some roles now starting to come forward around integrating public health with public planning, and of course, as the RTPI report sets out, those disciplines really started together but have drifted apart, and local authorities, since public health responsibilities came in 2013, you know, there has been some really interesting innovation about how to bring planning and public health together, but there's a lot further to go, particularly in the wake of this crisis. So we've been speaking to organisations like Guy's and St Thomas's charity and Great Ormond Street Hospital. We've already got an associate there who are looking at issues like from air quality to obesity, childhood obesity, to teenage mental health, and relationship between the built environment and public health on that front. Translating climate declarations into action. So obviously that remains very much a political priority, and we're increasingly placing associates with backgrounds in environmental engineering, decarbonisation, green infrastructure, biodiversity and ecology into local authorities to help translate a kind of high-level declaration into a really practical list that often works across different departments and teams across a council. And then I think increasingly important role here around this really the phase between a point where an application gets consent and when it's built out. So a kind of role to turn consents into completions to facilitate delivery, particularly where there are extant consents that are just not being built out. So how can the public sector really help push them forward? And that requires skills around development and delivery as well. And then finally, and this is partly also a response to the kind of noises we're getting around government reform, but a number of roles that are really around shaping the terms of new development. And what I mean by that is perhaps working earlier upstream in the planning process, and particularly if we've got less scope to work on things like household and minor applications, or even commercial to resi conversions as PD expands, but more scope to work on things like design coding, potentially even zoning, and obviously that requires skills around architecture and design and planning. So I think what's interesting for us is none of them are existing job descriptions. None of those roles, I think, are what I would call traditional development management and plan making roles. But I think all of those roles need to be seen as planning if we're really going to genuinely expand the agency of the profession and prove how critical planning is to the recovery. That's it for me.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Finn. Without further ado, we will pass on to Meeta, who will give us a bit more of her perspective from the private and legal perspective in terms of skilling up the profession in the Can't hear you, Meeta. Are you on mute? Working earlier. There's always something. I tell you what, if we can come on to Yemi, and then we'll try and get back to Meeta, and I'll get Lucy to try and sort something out. Is that okay, Yemi? Sorry, Meeta.
That's fine.
There's always something that was going to happen. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. I am going to talk about skills in relation.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. Network connection difficulties at the moment.
Tom, do you want me?
Okay.
The line's very we can't hear you, Meeta, unfortunately. Could you try logging on off again, and then we'll get Yemi to just start her talk, and then we'll come back to you if that's okay. Is that okay? I'll give you a call, Meeta. Yemi, are you okay to carry on?
Yes, I'm okay to carry on. Right. Meridian Water is 10,000 homes, 6,000 jobs over 25 years. The difference in this particular instance is that the local authority is acting as the master developer. And the consequence of that is that we need skills that are not your usual skill set in a local authority. So one of my challenges is that the process of becoming master developer was not where we started. It was a gradual one because of the challenges of meeting our objectives while trying to go into contract with the private sector. There were too many clashes, and but because we progressed the work alongside progressing the discussions, we just kept going. So we're now master developer, and we need some different skill sets from the usual local authority skill sets in the first instance, and then the fact that the objectives of this project in terms of changing the level of deprivation in the community and sort of moving up everybody as part of this process means that sustainability and climate change are at the heart of it. COVID-19 has made it very clear that while we were ambitious in our original planning, the reality of what has happened as a result of COVID means we need to be even more ambitious. So we've been very fortunate to get for somebody to have an organization like Public Practice, because increasingly going forward, we're going to have more of these partnerships, and therefore the local authorities have to have the same skill set or even sort of better skill sets than our private sector partners in order to deliver what we need to deliver for our communities. So I mean, it's no secret, I am a great supporter of public practice. I have recruited into Meridian Water 2 fantastic associates that are really leading the charge, not just for Meridian Water, but across the council. We have a very ambitious leader of the council she's the lead member for regeneration. She's the lead cabinet member for Meridian Water, and she's really driving this agenda, which means that we can't afford a situation where we're completely dependent on external consultants to tell us what we need to be doing. We need to have those conversations in-house ourselves and be able to drive the delivery in partnership with the private sector. So public practice for me is a fantastic example. I mean, I might be biased. I came from the private sector, admittedly 25, 30 years ago now, but it means it gives us an opportunity to sort of speak to private sector partners and offer them an opportunity to do stuff and do it slightly differently. I mean, I'll never forget one of the associates said he wanted to see whether he could become one of the good guys by joining the public sector rather. So we need a lot of that. The biggest challenge I've found in this process is getting the skill sets allied to public sector governance. And this is not really talking about the rules themselves, more about the attitude and the mindset to one-to-one understand the rules and work with them rather than this. Otherwise, the friction between sort of scale and local authority governance can very quickly end you up in a quite unhappy place. So it's the mindset, and what public practice does, the way we do the recruitment, is allows you to think it through the process, so that by the time you become a public practice associate in the public sector, you are aware of all of those things, and it doesn't become a frustration in the transition from private to public. I think I'll leave it there and take questions as part of the question and answer.
Okay, thanks, Yemi. And Meeta is back. Is it working?
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Brilliant.
No. Can you hear me now?
Yes, although it might be cutting out a bit. Do you want to start
Okay.
talking and we'll see how it goes?
Okay, I'll start talking. I'm going to make this super. I better make this super quick then, actually, just before I get cut off. Obviously, it will happen just before I'm about to make my best point. But yes, very quickly. So I'm here tasked specifically with trying to bring some views from the private sector. I've worked in both public and the private sector, but currently work in private practice as a lawyer. I've been involved with the RTPI for a long time and just been appointed very excitingly to the Board of Public Practice. But as I say, I'm here to talk about some views from the private sector. I'm only going to make a very few points, headline points, and they won't seem particularly linked to each other either. But the reason for that is, rather than thinking about sitting here and giving you just my views, I actually went and asked some private sector planners and people that work in the private sector what their views are about what skills planners should have. So not particularly directed question, but also now, in the future, and then also any comments around impact of COVID. I probably don't need to cover that because I think that's been much better covered by Richard and Finn and Yemi already. I suppose the first point that I want to make is actually, and Yemi, what Yemi's just said resonates with me a little. Conceptually, I struggle a little with the idea of private sector skills versus public sector skills. I think that, as planners, planning is planning. Planners are one profession. That's how we should behave. I think there's a lot of contention between us. I think that comes from, for structural reasons. It comes from economic reasons. It seems to always be in the ascendancy when planning departments are not well resourced. I think we're pitted against each other, and I think we need to take stock, actually, and think about that. And maybe now is a good time for that to happen, particularly with public practice doing what it's doing, as well as the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So, sorry, but that's that's my simple attitude towards things. Coming back to the responses that I got when I asked some phone a friend friendly private sector planners, and the first response wasn't about skills at all. It came back to resources. What they would love to see and love to be able to interact with are well-resourced planning departments with happy public sector planners in there that are there in sufficient numbers to be able to do their job properly. And to be trained properly and be able to keep up with everything, and also some depoliticisation of the process, because that's quite stressful once you layer that into the work of planning departments. the second most common response, again, it's pretty general, but I think this is all quite telling, because this is what they feel perhaps isn't there at the moment, is that planners, and this is planners generally, should have a rounded and sort of adequate skills and knowledge, not necessarily in depth, but adequate, to be able to make balanced planning judgments, to be able to put all those things together and make balanced planning judgments, and to do it with confidence. And that's something that I hear not just from private sector planners at all, that is a public sector thing as well. There is something about being able to feel professionally confident and make those decisions with confidence and without fear, I think. So that was another general point. The other thing that came out of that, actually, again, it's another recurring theme, I think we'll all agree, is just the sheer number of issues that planners are supposed to have to get their heads around, and they're increasing all the time. I think the example that was made in the context of those comments was biodiversity net gain, and the fact that, every time you get a new issue that a planner has to deal with, we're talking about new specialisms, we're talking about potentially having to have specialist officers, and local authorities can't do that a lot of the time. It's a really big ask. So there is some work to do around that, I think, as well. If I had to identify some other common themes, probably design was one that came up. I think there was a feeling that perhaps, from a planning education perspective, that there ought to be more around design and people having the vocabulary for design, because it's often, well, it's very subjective, but it's also quite a contentious area and something we all feel very strongly about. And then I suppose the other thing was that old favourite, commerciality. And when I say commerciality, the reason that it came up was not about viability. It wasn't a viability thing. It wasn't this narrow part of the development process or the planning process, because and that is something that's become very contentious and very value laden. What they were actually talking about was something much broader. And the one really interesting thing that came up for me was talking to former planning consultants who were now in-house at a developer. And what they said to me was, I thought I'd worked in the private sector and I knew all about commerciality. I was commercially aware. I know how this process works. And then I went in-house and I realised how little I knew. Planning is only a part of the development process. It's only part of what we're trying, the whole process of making places, getting built development on the ground. I had to learn about how it fitted into construction programming, just general construction issues. I had to understand the whole process of development finance. I had to understand how it all fits together, construction, financing, funding considerations, phasing. Planning was only a small part of that. And I really feel that that is something that I would have really, really benefited from knowing about when I started my career in planning. And that doesn't matter whether I'm on the private sector side or whether I'm on the public sector side. So I'm aware I'm running out of time, and I'm worried I'm about to get cut off. Hopefully I have made all my best points before that happens. But just to conclude, I suppose I've mentioned a few things, and I think tellingly all the responses I was getting, they were about skills that we need now and going forward into the future. They're sort of fundamental things that we can't get away from. Clearly, there are the two big issues that we've got COVID. And the other thing, which is the government's intention to fundamentally shake up the planning system. I won't talk about the latter because obviously that's an entire webinar by itself, or at least 10 of them. But in relation to the former, I think I'd probably just echo a couple of things that have already been said. And I think it's largely about adaptability and flexibility, and that's what's going to be needed going forward on all sides. And a lot of creativity, because I think the big concern is that we do have a system that isn't perfect, but a lot of us buy into it. But we also know it doesn't move very quickly and it's not very agile. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Meeta. And I think we managed to hear all that, which is very good news. And actually, I think we'll stick with the kind of the point around the skills and the types of skills. We've had a couple of questions coming in around skills, and we wanted to do a couple of polls with the audience as we go. So I'll launch the first poll, which is actually, where do we think the skill gaps lie among planners, particularly in London and South East? And Finn and then Yemi, I think it's probably Finn's kind of touched on the new types of skills, but is there anything specific that's missing amongst planners in in your experience? And is there a deficiency in education? So if we maybe come to Finn first, and then I'll just launch a poll, which makes Finn.
So there are two ways of looking at this. So one is that you're looking at what's missing within local authorities, and if you look at all of the statistics, planning officers are the hardest discipline for local authorities to recruit of any discipline across local government, and that includes legal expertise or child social social workers, children's social workers. So even where there are vacancies, local authorities aren't able to access the people to fill those posts. And the most difficult kind of post as a whole that we consistently hear from local authorities are senior planning officers. At that level across London and the South East, over a quarter of recruitment exercises fail to appoint. And often there are repeat recruitment exercises, which obviously cost quite a lot of money, interims working in the meantime, which cost even more. And there's a kind of opportunity cost to that whole process. So there's definitely a big gap in skills around senior planning officers, or the inability to recruit at that level. If you then look at what kind of skills planners have, and by planners in this sense I mean, let's take it that you mean RTPI town planners. I think the skills that local authorities look for from our associates aren't necessarily technical expertise in things like the specialism that they can get from the private sector. The skills they're looking for are the ability to just get on with people, communicate persuasively and convincingly to politicians and members of the public, to get stuff done, just to get on and deliver things and be creative and entrepreneurial. So those skills, I think, a planning profession can do, but I think what drums it out of, or makes it quite hard to get on and do stuff and to communicate persuasively and be creative, is when your whole professional way of working is limited to kind of two dimensions, which is either DM or policy or plan making. They have very specific languages, very specific processes, and if anything, I'd say the kind of roles we're seeing coming forward are planning. They're town planning roles, but they require planners who can speak a language that's broader than just the DM process or just the process of getting a plan adopted. Not that those are unimportant, they're critical, but we have to be able to communicate the value of that to broader audiences than an inspector.
Thanks, Ben. Yemi, does that chime with you? Do you think the planning profession, or the concept of planning as we got it at the moment, is too binary?
I agree, because in order to move projects forward, you really need your planners to be sort of the first project manager, as it were, coordinating around all of these disciplines, and especially around the engagement that needs to happen in order to deliver a planning consent. On whether it's persuading the community to engage with the process, or it's persuading the politicians to agree with your view. So like Finn said, it's very much about the communication, and it doesn't start when the planning application hits your desk. So we are finding one of the things that our planners and public practice has been very helpful in actually filling those roles, because they were really difficult to fill. I mean, to the point where the few planners we had so much flexi leave that they could not come to the office for a year and it would be fine. I exaggerate, but you get the point. So it's really about their project management skills. We are a bit siloed in local government, because we've got estate regeneration is different from sort of placemaking, but actually they, especially through the local plan process, they all need to link together and deliver what our politicians want us to deliver for them. So it's trying to get into a place where it's not bogged down in planning. The planning is a process that sort of almost begins from we need to build more houses, and how do we deliver it? So it's the spatial planning, it's the negotiating with the private sector who are delivering on their own land, and the delivering on our own land. And the fact that, as Richard said earlier, these plans are not, we can't keep restricting them to one local authority area. The spatial dimension has to be so much bigger. So those are the kind of skills that we need from our planners, rather than at the moment focus on pure technical planning roles. I think maybe what I'm looking for is our planners need to be placemakers and need to be the project managers for those places.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And it was interesting in the Building Beautiful Commission report. I think the one thing the RTPI managed to get in was the idea of chief planner, but actually they didn't use the word planner, they used placemaker. So Richard and then Meeta, do you think that the definition of a planner should be broadened? And do you think that then there needs to be a kind of a greater breadth of skills across the profession, or do you think it's about right? Start with Richard, and going on some of your research and actually your background in public and private practice. Oh, sorry, Richard, can't hear you.
Hello?
Yeah, there you go.
One of Finn's spotlights has been on the fact that we used to be like this, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And there was a time, I'm often reminded, when London Borough planning departments had 3 sections. They had development control, plan making, and implementation, and that seems a good way to go. For example, Tim was talking about moving consents into completions. There was a time when councils would apply for permission to themselves to do things, and that doesn't need only to be on their land, it could be on someone else's land. So if you've got a load of boxes along the A3, for example, why doesn't the council apply for permission to turn those boxes into something else? That provides the development industry with a very useful kind of sense of security, because there's already permission and they can then start doing what they need to do to get money and so on. So I particularly agree that the skill around persuading people of the value of doing something, one of the things that we have found is that people who enter the profession from having done something else first are often quite good at doing that. So you might have a degree in something and you sort of go around the world, or you do something else, and then maybe later in your 20s you think, well, what could I now do as a profession? Start working planning, maybe do day release and do a planning qualification, but you come to it with an awful lot of other stuff that could include, as Finn says, getting on with people, which you've done because you've done some other work. So that, I think, we need to be very open to what is the pipeline of people that are wanting to do planning, and how can we get as many diverse people in with perhaps a broad range of life skills as well.
Meeta, what's your view? I mean, again, I think, and my experience kind of working around the world actually is that a planner in other countries is something very different to a planner, or what is seen as a planner in this country, which is, as we say, and some of the, Tony on the question and answers is kind of saying it's almost a binary, or it's 3 things. Should we be broader as an institute and as a profession, do you think, Meeta?
Gosh, from the perspective of the Institute, I think it's a debate that we have internally all the time, and it's just been going on for years, frankly. I think the reality is, and I think that this is where we get to every time, is that, we have the word planner, and, we have planning courses where you can become, accredited and then go off into a job where your title is planner. But actually, when we look around and we look more broadly throughout local authorities, we look more broadly throughout consultancies, actually, particularly the larger ones, which are multidisciplinary anyway. What we see is a lot of people who are doing what we consider to be planning or planning related activities, but they're not called planners. So I think that actually, you know, our planning courses are taking people, are churning out people who don't just go into jobs where they call themselves planners. They are doing broader things and wider things. And I do think one thing about planning, and I don't know, well, I probably could tell you if I had more time to sit down and kind of analyse it more, but I think we do get quite a lot of people from different backgrounds, actually. I think we have lots of different routes into planning. There are different ways that you can qualify. You know, some would probably say too many, but you can, you know, there are different routes into the profession for different types of people. And I think it welcomes different types of people from different backgrounds and then allows them to specialise or go off into different avenues which are linked, where you use the same skills. You might be doing you know, similar activities, but actually it's a different angle on the same thing. Feeling a different part of the foot, I think, is what it's called.
Yeah. Okay. And before we move on, I'd be interested to know. So I've come across a lot of people who I regard as planners who would get very offended if we were to call them a planner. Is the issue a branding thing? Do you think, Finn?
No, I think that's a bit of a red herring, and you know, I don't know. Personally, I think you can try and keep up with the times and rebrand and change the name from planning to place shaping to place making to urban change management to whatever seems fashionable at the time. But as Richard just referred to earlier, planning has such a proud and amazing history of being really bold and creative and has such strong public purpose. If you look back to its history, I think personally, it's stronger to reclaim a broader agency for planning than to constantly try and disassociate yourself with the recent past, and in doing so disassociate yourself with a really strong, rich heritage that planning comes from, particularly throughout the 20th century. So we've talked about that a lot in public practice. Should we be talking about public planning? Is this really public planning? Especially when we're now recruiting people who are specialists in public health and environmental sustainability, surveying. But for me, this is all about the built environment. It's about thinking very long term and a broad scale, about big communities, and that's what planning is brilliant to do. I come from a background in architecture, but if I realised that was what planning was about, I think I would have done planning earlier. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on a little bit onto the thorny issue of planning reform and whether we are or whether we aren't going to get a planning white paper at some point in the next few months. Reform is afoot, potentially with a focus on design and a focus on zoning, whatever that could possibly mean. So I guess there's an initial question, and we'll do a poll as well, as to whether you think that what's kind of on the table will require more or less people. Because it strikes me that, read things like the policy exchange, they effectively want to do away with a lot of the planners or the problems that they see being caused by planners. But the reality could be something very different. So just try that as a poll. And I guess, Richard, do you want to kick off on that one?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, there's two, I suppose, clumps of thinking on this. One, as you say, is that the great thing would be that we could have lots of redundancies. We don't need people to do this, so they can, we can make savings. And this is very much the, I think it was Eric Pickles that complained about people driving Maseratis. Wouldn't it be great we didn't have so many expensive consultants and expensive people working in planning departments taking money from hard-working families? But that's one line. The other one, which is I think a subtler one, is this notion, which I think is a little bit in the Building Beautiful kind of way of thinking, that if planners did less checkbox and sort of not very rewarding and uncreative activity, they would be free to do some more creative activity. I think it's quite important to make sure that the first proposition isn't sold under the banner of the second, and actually if there are reforms, they really do involve more worthwhile and beneficial activity, and it's not simply a kind of front for making lots of redundancies. And I do remember you may recall there was a time when the Cameron government was proposing that we would have what I call planners in garages. You know, the idea that we would enable or force local authorities to outsource the writing of application reports on applications to committee to whoever the applicant wanted to give the work to. And I had a long chat with a civil servant who I no longer have dealings with, who made it very clear that from their point of view, the purpose was to get people, you know, well, let's get people out of retirement in their garages and doing this work. You know, let's really drive down the cost of local authority planning. And I was thinking, these are people, a lot of whom are earning well less than £30,000, and we're talking about driving down the cost. So it's curious that the civil service had this view that somehow this was sort of creaming off lots of money that should be better spent on other things. And you know, how little do you know about certain many planning officers' jobs in local authorities?
Yeah, I mean, does that chime with your experience? I mean, I think there was some data out recently that shows that there'd been a decline, I think it was of about 60 or 70% in the actual funding on planning departments over the past 10 years. I mean, is that kind of your experience in your job?
Our planning department has had to be pretty creative because they're a revenue service, so they're really there's sort of chicken and egg. They don't have enough people to get the planning permissions in, but they can't get the planning permissions in because they're not allowed to have enough people. So they've had to sort of try and review how they operate to get some more funding in order to get the number of planners that they need. It's one of the consequences of austerity, and we are paying the price now. And I hope that we don't make the same mistakes all over again, because it's essential that we have proper planning service to make sure that recovery from COVID and, like you said earlier, preparation for the next pandemic, whatever that is going to be, leaves us in a more robust position. There's a limit to how much income planning departments can generate before it becomes a cash a cash for approval system. But we have design advisory groups and pre-planning applications where you come and discuss with the planners sort of even before you submit the application to make sure that the direction you're going in is one that they, even if they don't object strongly to, and sort of find compromises along the way, so that when they get into the formal planning system, it all moves a bit quicker. But yes, it's a challenge that if we're going to change the new, I don't know what the new planning rules are going to be. All of this rewrite planning white paper, what I'm hearing is not particularly encouraging. And I think if the idea is to reduce the resources that go into planning, I think they're going to find they're going to end up needing twice as many resources as the one they think they're going to get rid of. But planning for the world, we need to get them to the decision makers, because the answers are all in there. You know, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. The answers are all in there.
And Meeta, what's your hunch on all this? I mean, there's a lot of solicitors in the profession getting very excited about zoning and that sort of thing going forward. How do you think it's going to play out? I mean, no one really knows at the moment, do they?
No, no one does know at the moment. Solicitors are getting excited, obviously, because they just get excited at the thought of any new legislation, because that's what we all love looking at. But no one knows. I think there is suspicion that you know, any transition is going to take some time, and you will probably have two systems running alongside each other for a period of time. And again, that doesn't really herald reduction in numbers of staff required, but an increase And the other thing that we always forget, well, perhaps the government always seems to forget, is that every time you bring in new legislation, every time you change, fundamental headline policy in fundamental ways, everybody has to practice, has to get trained on it, they have to understand it before they can actually start to use it in the system and use it properly. So a fundamental change is also going to need, time for people to learn what the new system is, and including, if you have two systems running in parallel, how those work together as well.
Thanks, Meeta. We had you really slow and then really fast on that. I think we managed to understand. Okay, kind of running out of time, so I'll just finish. I think. So imagine that you got to meet kind of a government advisor or a politician over the next few months. I mean, what one message would you give to them around planning and skills planning? So maybe let's start with Richard, who's been giving this a lot of thought over the past months.
Resource planners to do more than that bare minimum statutory activity if you want government goals on climate and housing to be achieved.
Great. Yemi?
I would agree entirely. Properly resourcing our planners would make a big difference.
Yeah. Okay. Meeta, is that fine with you? Is there anything else that you would add? What would be, if you got to meet Boris or Dominic Cummings, what would you say?
Well, oh gosh, I got to stay polite. On the basis that I do, I agree with the resourcing issue. I think though we all have to be honest. Our planning system isn't perfect, and I think that in terms of trying to make it better, we have to have these conversations about that ourselves as planners, and not just sort of criticise this bit here or that bit there, and tinker in the same way we've seen being done to the system. In fact, over recent years, I think the resourcing issue is fundamental. I think if you want any changes, first of all, resource your system properly, then see what needs fixing. Because once you've done that, then you actually know what could be done better, because it's the system rather than it's the resourcing. So I think it's a combination of those two things.
Great. Finn, and final point from you.
Yeah, thanks. I always reminded of a phrase that I heard someone say, which is the right planners can work around the wrong system, but the right system or the right policy can't necessarily work around a lack of good planners. So, I think I would agree in many ways with some of the direction that was set out in things like Building Better, Building Beautiful, which is to move some of the planning further upstream, community engagement further upstream, to enable planners to be actually more prescriptive, more creative, more visionary about what should happen to the future of places, and to do this shift perhaps away from some of the smaller scale work that we do spend a lot of our time doing. And someone put it, to answer the last question a bit in this as well, someone put it very simply in our round of interviews for our report. They said we don't need less people, we need less people spending time on crap jobs that don't add any value. And if there can be a way of using technology intelligently rather than crude expansion of PD to actually free up some resources from validation, from household and minor applications, and allow planners to plan, as Richard said, and if we can capture that in expanded roles, and if we can make sure that those roles are funded not through planning applications, because as we mentioned already, the more we rely on planning applications to service and resource our departments, the more reactive planning departments naturally have to be, and it's a dangerous cycle to get into when the housing market is not heading in a good direction. So we genuinely need that resourcing to look beyond the delivery of local plans, look beyond the processing of the applications, and to fund what a more proactive system would look like.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there. Couple of plugs for me. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks' time on the 24th, which will be a career story event. So we've got Victoria Hills and Sam Stafford, who many of you know from the 50 Shades of Planning podcast, talking about issues around their careers. So there's some good career advice hopefully happening there. The RTPI London is also open for elections. So we're desperate actually for new leaders to come through. We don't have a vice chair or a junior vice chair, but there are various opportunities to get involved with RTPI London and also the Institute nationwide. And then Finn, I think you probably want to do a plug for the public practice programme.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So after you've tuned into the next one of these and submitted yourself for election, one of the RTPI opportunities, also think about applying to our next cohort or actually hosting a placement. So it does look like the interest for our next cohort of public practice will be probably the highest ever from the side of applicants. And if there's any time if there's anyone here at a local authority who's got the opportunity to recruit, if there's any time to recruit, it's now. So yeah, please do have a look at that. All the information is on our website. Applications in by the 20th of July.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and to the audience for joining in. I hope you all have good weekends, and we'll hopefully see you next time. Okay, thanks all.
Thanks a lot.